Hey, we're here for the midweek podcast again, and we're in week 2 of Simple Rules. And this week's rule: do good. Sunday's sermon covered the main arc. The order matters, do good comes after do no harm, and not before it, and doing good is a decision rather than a feeling. We were in the Good Samaritan, in Galatians 6, in Matthew 25. And there's a lot in those texts, and I didn't get to all of it. So today I want to pull out a few things I think are worth the midweek conversation. Specifically, something from Isaiah 58 that I only grazed on Sunday, a piece of Matthew 25 that I find quietly astonishing, and something about the Good Samaritan story, specifically the question the lawyer actually asked, that I think changes what you hear Jesus saying. So let's take a few minutes. Isaiah 58. I mentioned it briefly on Sunday. God redefining the fast. Is not this the fast I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to share your bread with the hungry. And then I moved on, but this chapter deserves more than a passing reference. The context: this is probably addressed to the community returning from Babylonian exile. They've been away for 70 years, and now they're finally home again. And they're doing their religious practices. They're fasting, they're praying, they're doing the rituals of devotion. And they're going through the motions of faithfulness. But God's response through Isaiah is essentially, I see what you're doing, and I need you to understand why it isn't working. Not because the practices are wrong. God is not saying stop the fasting. God is saying you are fasting while your workers go without their wages. You're abstaining from food while your neighbor cannot access food. And you are performing religious piety with your mouth while your hands are doing harm with your money and your power. The external practice and the internal reality are completely disconnected. And then God reframes the whole thing. So what is the fast God chooses? Well, look at verse 6. Loose the bonds of injustice. Undo the straps of the yoke. Let the oppressed go free. And in verse 7 continues on. Share your bread with the hungry. Bring the homeless poor into your house. Clothe the naked. This is not a list of charitable activities to add to your religious life. This is a redefinition of what religious life is. The act of goodness is not a supplement to worship. It is what worship looks like when it leaves the sanctuary and moves into the world. Have you ever heard people say, oh, I really liked the worship this morning? A lot of times they're referring to the music, to a visceral, emotional experience that they have. But God is saying here, that's not worship. Worship is being in obedience to me. And John Wesley read the prophets, and he understood this. So his second rule, do good, it's not a second-tier rule for a spiritually advanced people. It's the natural outward flow of life that takes seriously the God it claims to worship. If the outward flow isn't happening, Isaiah would want us to ask an honest question about what's actually going on in the interior. I want to name that because I think a lot of us, and myself included, have gotten very comfortable with the compartment. Church is church, daily life is daily life. They touch sometimes on Sunday morning, but the rest of the week they stay in their lanes. Isaiah is not okay with that, and neither is John Wesley. And I think if we're honest, neither are we when we really stop to think about it. In Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46, we read about the sheep and the goats. I used it on Sunday to make the point that the scale is exactly right. The cup of water, the visit, the welcome, these are all the full measure of faithfulness, not consolation prizes. But there's a detail in the scene I want to look at more carefully because I think it's the most interesting thing in the whole passage. The righteous, they're surprised. Lord, when did we see you and hungry and give you food? When did we see you stranger and welcome you? When did we see you sick and visit you? They don't know. They genuinely do not recognize what they have done or who they were doing it to. Now, if you were writing this story to teach people to do good things, that's a strange choice. You'd expect the righteous to say, yes, Lord, we saw you in the hungry and we served you faithfully. That would reinforce the lesson. See Christ in the poor, respond accordingly. But that's not what happens. The righteous are genuinely confused. They don't remember doing anything particularly holy. They were just responding to the person in front of them, routinely, without calculation, without tracking it. And I think that is the actual portrait of mature do good. Not a deliberate strategy of serving Christ through the poor, not a transaction you make consciously every time. I'm doing this act because I know Christ is in this person. It's just, this person is hungry. I have food, so of course I'm going to do something about that. The goodness has become ordinary, habitual. It no longer requires a decision each time because it has been practiced long enough that the response is now automatic, like breathing. And that's the goal, and it's worth saying clearly, because I think we sometimes set the bar of doing good at the level of dramatic, conscious, clearly intentional acts of service, things you'd write about in a newsletter. But Matthew 25 is describing something quieter. The cup of water given without thinking about it. The visit made because you just do that. The welcome extended before you've even thought about whether to extend it. Wesley's second rule is not asking you to perform goodness. It's asking you to practice it long enough that it stops being a performance. That's a much harder and more interesting goal. Now, let's take another look at the Good Samaritan, because there's something in how the story is framed, and I mentioned it briefly on Sunday, and I think it's worth some midweek attention. The lawyer's question, the one that prompts the parable, starts with, "Who is my neighbor?" It's a limiting question. He's trying to find out where his obligation ends. If he can get Jesus to define neighbor narrowly enough, he knows exactly how much he's required to do. He can fulfill the obligation and stop worrying about the rest. And then Jesus tells the parable. He doesn't answer the lawyer's question. Instead, he asks a completely different one. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And the lawyer the lawyer asked, who qualifies as my neighbor? Who am I obligated to help? And Jesus asks, who acted as a neighbor? Who made themselves responsible for someone in need? That is a total reframing of the question. The lawyer was asking for a category. Jesus was talking about a relationship. The lawyer wanted a definition that would let him know when he was done. Jesus is describing a posture that has no done. Go and do likewise. Jesus' command at the end. It's not go and help people who qualify for your assistance. It's go and be the kind of person who makes others their neighbor. It's a posture, not a checklist. And postures take a long time to develop. That's why the rule is do good rather than do some good things. The rule isn't about accumulating acts. It's about becoming the kind of person from whom acts of goodness flow without requiring a calculation every time, which is exactly what Matthew 25's surprised righteous people have become. It takes time to get there. But every deliberate decision, every time you stop when you could keep walking, is practice toward it. Okay, one practice for the rest of the week. The sermon's invitation on Sunday was specific. Sometime between now and next Sunday, there will be a moment when you can stop or you can keep walking. And the invitation was stop. For the rest of this week, I want to suggest something I'm going to call the stopping experiment. It's this. When you notice a moment where you could stop and you do stop, pay attention to what happens in the space between the noticing and the stopping. Not to analyze it, not to journal about it, just to notice. What is the thing that makes stopping feel like a cost? Is it time, energy, the awkwardness of being the person who stopped, the fear that you'll get it wrong? Just notice. When you stop to help this week, no matter how small the act, notice what made stopping feel like a cost in that moment. What happened after you stopped that wouldn't have happened otherwise? Again, it's not a journal entry, just a few seconds of honest attention. And the reason I'm suggesting this particular thing is that the path from doing good requires a decision every time to doing good is just what I do runs through a lot of repetitions of noticing the cost and choosing to stop anyway. You can't skip to the habit without going through the decision, and you can't go through the decision wisely without paying attention to what makes it hard. So that's it. The stopping experiment. Notice and stop. Pay attention to what that costs and what it gives. And I'll see you Sunday, week 3. Stay in love with God, the one that makes all of this sustainable.